Bonsoir, bonsoir tout le monde. Nous PAMM Seloud avec Mob Language Services et à soir son plaisir pour moi assurer interprétation pour nous dans la langue créole ensemble avec collègue Meluman et nous avons une équipe là qui là pour faire interprétation en créole en espagnol. Donc sous ta remettande en langue créole ou après les dans 305 901 26 92 et puis ça ou après numéro écrit là sur pancarte là pendant on va entrer pour chita et nous disons déjà merci pour participation, merci d'être ensemble avec nous encore sous ta remettande en créole haïtien ou après les 305 901 26 92. Now I'm going to pass it to my colleague.
Good afternoon. Can folks hear me? ¿Me escuchan? Ok. Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es María Angélica. Mis pronombres son ella, ellex. Y hoy estamos proveyendo interpretación en criollo haitiano y en español con Mob Language Services. Entonces, si ustedes quieren escuchar este programa en criollo haitiano o en español, pueden llamar a la línea de interpretación usando su teléfono. Para español, el número es 786-665-8802. 786-665-8802. Y pueden encontrar estos números también escritos en los letreros a la entrada. Si tienen alguna pregunta de interpretación o si quieren algún tipo de ayuda, por favor, levanten su mano en cualquier momento o nos pueden ir a ver arriba si es posible. Bueno, gracias. Good afternoon. My name is Maria Angelica. My pronouns are she and they. And today, our colleagues and I are providing Creole and Spanish interpretation with Mob Language Services. So if you would like to listen to today's program in Spanish or in Creole, you may do so by using our interpretation lines. If you would like the numbers, they are at the signs, behind these signs here. And if you have any questions or need any support with interpretation, just please raise your hand and we'll go to you. Or you can also go see us at the top in the interpretation table. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Pettis Art Museum Miami. I know it's been a long, fun week. I hope Miami Art Week has been treating you good. I'd like to thank you for being here. My name's Marie Vickles. I'm the Director of Education here at the Pettis Art Museum Miami. And again, thank you for joining us. Those of you that are on YouTube, thank you for joining us digitally, virtually. So as we get started, I would like to first acknowledge that we are speaking today from the ancestral homelands of the Calusa, Tocobaga, and Tequesta peoples, which is currently stewarded by the Miccosukee and Seminole nations. We encourage you to learn about our indigenous neighbors and support their environmental and conservation priorities. Today's panel discussion focuses on indigenous contemporary art of the South Florida Miccosukee and Seminole tribes. The panel will present and discuss the art of various Miccosukee and Seminole contemporary artists from an art historical perspective that details the knowledge systems behind their work and practice. Our speakers will delve into the contemporary patchwork as it relates to artist Felipe Mujica's current exhibition at PAMM, The Swaying Motion on the Bank of the River Falls, in which he collaborated with contemporary artist Khadijah Cypress. Our panel today features exhibition artists Felipe Mujica and Khadijah Cypress, exhibition curator Jennifer Inacio, art historian Durante Blais-Billie, and poet, artist, and environmental activist Houston Cypress. A few thank yous before we get started. I would like to thank the incredible team of people working so very hard to produce our PAMM education programs throughout this week and really every day. This is an everyday kind of thing, and it takes a lot of people to make these programs happen. I would like to thank and acknowledge Anita Bram, Associate Director of Adult Programs and Audience Engagement, our world-class audiovisual team, Denise Faxes, Andrew Bird, thank you so much, and Lazaro Yanes on the cameras and photography, making us all look great. Thank you. Thank you all. Okay, now a bit about our panelists. They have been working and living within these creative and cultural spaces for many years, putting in a lot of work, forging paths, and I do think it's important that we talk about their backgrounds so you know a little bit about where they're coming from. Starting with our curator, Jennifer Inacio. She is the associate curator here at the Pettis Art Museum, where she recently, of course, curated the exhibition with Felipe and Khadijah. Selected curated exhibitions of hers also include My Body, My Rules, recently in 2020, Barbara Wagner and Benjamin de Burca, Estas Vendo Coisas, 2019, Pedro Neves Marquez, Amorida, which was in 2018, and the museum's first augmented reality exhibition, Felice Grodin, Invasive Species, which started in 2017 and is actually still ongoing. You can find QR codes around the museum and experience some augmented reality art. She is also an ambassador of the 555, or the 55 Project, an organization with the mission to promote Brazilian visual artists and cultural projects in the United States. She also curated Gustavo Prado, The Undercurrent in 2020, Nadia Taquari Oriki, Bowing to the Head in 2019, and What I Really Wanted to Tell You, 2019. Jennifer holds a master's in contemporary art theory from Goldsmiths University in London. Okay, and Felipe Mujica studied art at the University de Católica de Chile just out of art school in 1997. He co-founded with Diego Fernandez and Jose Luis Villablanca the artist-run space Galeria Chilena. Sorry, maybe I should have brought glasses. I was like, I can read this. Which operated between 1999 and 2005, first as a nomadic and commercial art gallery, and then later as a collaborative art project, a curatorial experiment, if you will. In early 2000, Felipe moved to New York City, where he currently lives. And parallel and interrelated to his own work, Felipe has organized and produced many collaborative projects, which include mostly exhibitions and the editing, design, and publishing of books. Felipe has also exhibited internationally in venues such as Dimensions Variable, right here in Miami, Sindicato República Dominicana, Museo de Arte Moderno de Medellín, Galería Gabriela Mistral, Santiago de Chile, Gallery von Bartha, Basel, CRAC Alsace, there's a hard one, Altkirch, Basel S. Kampf, 32A Biennial de Sao Paulo, the Sao Paulo Museo, Museo Experimental El Eco, and that's in Mexico City. Also, he's shown work at the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts, Harvard University, Fondazione Merz that looks like in Turin in Italy, and then Museo del Barrio in New York City, to name a few. He is currently exhibiting here at the Perez Art Museum, so please check out the exhibition if you haven't already. Khadijah Cypress. She lives here in Florida on the Miccosukee Reservation and has been doing patchwork for the last 6 years after learning the craft techniques from her grandmother. In July of 2019, she founded the Miccosukee Creativity Center, a community center on the reservation to foster the traditions of patchwork in her tribe while helping community members learn patchwork, beadwork, baskets, and other crafts. In December of 2019, she coordinated the fashion show for the annual Miccosukee Indian Arts and Crafts Festival. She recently collaborated and oversaw the patchwork production for artist Felipe Mujica's exhibition right here at the PAMM. Durante Blais-Billie is a Two-Spirit member of the Seminole tribe of Florida. They hold an MA in Art History and Management from the University of St. Andrews and have served their tribe as Assistant Director of the Atatiki Museum. Their work focuses on reclaiming Indigenous knowledge systems through native-led education with the central mission of decolonial healing. They are dedicated to exploring the intersections of Seminole identity, Indigenous knowledge, and Seminole visual culture. Dante utilizes their lived experience and the knowledge gifted to them by their community to negotiate what art history truly looks like for their people. They are also an advocate for cultural continuation through intergeneral organization and serve as a group leader for the Independent Youth Council Future Indigenous Leaders of South Florida. Working in their community, Dante is a founding contributor of their tribe's first Two-Spirit Affirmation Project, where they advocate for Two-Spirit and LGBTQ+ rights as an essential part to community well-being. And finally, Reverend Houston Cypress. Reverend Houston R. Cypress, put that in there, is a two-spirit poet and artist and activist from the Otter Clan of the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida. He resides on the Miccosukee Reservation, located west of Miami, Florida, and he maintains a number of traditional villages located on tree islands scattered throughout Water Conservation Area 3A, the part of the Greater Everglades known as the historic River of Grass. The Greater Everglades was a refuge for his ancestors and continues to be the source of traditional plant medicines. Through his nonprofit, Love the Everglades movement, Houston serves Miccosukee society as an advocate for cultural preservation, environmental protection, business development, and sovereignty. Most recently, Houston was commissioned by ICA Miami to present What Endures, a non-binary interfaith travelogue set amidst the landscapes of the Greater Everglades. The new video work is a part of the museum's digital commission series. Houston also created the film Every Step is a Prayer, executive produced by Super Blue and Nowness. Houston is in post-production on his next film collaboration with Miccosukee artist Renee Magnari to premiere in early 2022. He's currently enjoying 2 concurrent artist residencies, the Heat Exchange by Bass Fisher Invitational and Rogaland Kunstcenter, and the Thread Residency by the Masagitis Foundation. He invites you to join him in creating portals between worlds. I'll definitely join you for that, Houston. We will have a short moment for questions at the end of this program. So if you're joining us on YouTube, please post your questions in the comments section while you're watching today. And we'll have mics that pass around for those of you with us here in person. And please wait for the mic, because then everyone on YouTube can also hear you and it becomes a part of the recording post-show. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Felipe Mujica, Khadijah Cypress, Jennifer Inacio, Durante Blais-Billie, and Houston Cypress.
Okay, we can take our masks off if you want. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, all the participants. It's always a pleasure to have you here, and in conjunction with the exhibition, teaching us and learning, collaborating. So we are very excited as a museum to be collaborating with the Miccosukee and Seminole. And hopefully, like I said, this is one of many to come. Now, before we start digging into questions, I just want to let you know that we'll have a set of pictures running and looping around us. It's a series of grouping of pictures of artists, also the process, and some artifacts and examples of patchwork and indigenous contemporary art that we have gathered for you to see. And we'll be referencing them here and there. So I think to first, open the question, open this dialogue, I want to, point out that we're always wondering, right? Like, what is contemporary art? And that's such a difficult question too. I mean, difficult and not really. Contemporary is what's happening now, what is being created now. And then when we talk about indigenous contemporary art, I'm curious to know, like, why is there this why is indigenous art distinguished, right? How can we include it in the mainstream conversations of contemporary art? And this is why we're here today, to bring this discussion to our audiences, for us to start questioning and understand that this dialogue does belong here this week with art from all over the world. So I don't know, Dante, maybe you can open up this conversation.
Yeah, I think I'll open up by discussing even the name of this panel, because that was something we all tossed around. Like, should it be contemporary indigenous art? Should it be contemporary art and us just not acknowledge or pigeonhole the art that's created as indigenous? And I think to answer that question that you brought up, like why indigenous contemporary art or what makes art contemporary, it's really important for us to all step away from, I guess, the Eurocentric ideology of what we see as art. Because as we'll talk more in depth later amongst all of us, but visual culture for our people exists beyond Western concepts of art and craft and institutions that uphold art and institutions that uphold one form of art higher than the other. And I think something that's really important for people to understand, especially during Art Basel or when they're interacting with contemporary indigenous artists like Khadijah and myself in Houston, is that oftentimes our art is fundamentally exoticized. And I say that in the sense of indigenous contemporary art is often removed from the context of our own knowledge systems and what visual culture means to us beyond what the Western world describes as, I don't know, form and function and aesthetics. There's something much deeper for us in the way we express ourselves. And there's a history behind that beyond just what the mainstream culture knows. And secondary to that exoticization is this pigeonholing of indigenous art. You see that a lot, like contemporary indigenous artist, or it's an exhibit for indigenous art. And why can't our art exist and discuss on the same level as other contemporary artists? You know, seeing us through that ethnographic lens is ultimately exoticizing us for consumption. It's exoticizing us so we can be safely known and safely, I guess, exploited and seen, and our agency is taken away. So that's something that all of us here are really passionate about, is really, I guess, unmapping these institutions of art and how we interact with it, and making sure we're able to negotiate our own identities as indigenous people, or maybe as just a person alive today, in the way we do art and with our identities that we show through that. And I'll stop talking for now, but that's just a little intro into what we're all thinking.
Yes. You brought up something really interesting, right? That art, indigenous art is usually exoticized. And I've been seeing a lot, at the fair, there are a lot of artworks by Native Americans. Jeffrey Gibson, Nicholas Gallinan had a whole booth dedicated to the works. And this exoticization, or the trend, like how do we keep these dialogues and investing in indigenous contemporary art, but also sustaining this dialogue and not letting this lose after it's become it's a trend? And what do you see that's important for us as institutions, as art professionals, to keep this going even after this moment? I feel like a lot of people are interested in getting to know and more curious about, but how do we make it more sustainable for years to come? I don't know who wants to answer that.
I can touch upon it really fast if people still want to mull over the question, but for me, I think the most important part of de-exoticizing or just letting indigenous art be what the creator wants it to be is maintaining the agency of the artist. So a lot of times in institutions like museums or exhibits, it's a really sterile environment, which is essentially institutionalizing what art is. And that takes away from, the artist's ability to even know where their work is being placed or what's being beside their art. I think is something that's fundamentally important, especially for marginalized artists who haven't had that luxury, especially historically in the narratives of the way they're presenting themselves. So I think agency in the artist is something that's really important, because I think that you can't say a blanket statement of what's de-exoticizing, because some artists, indigenous artists, like to usurp that exoticization and play into it. Maybe that's their point. Maybe that's what they want to do. And that's up for the indigenous artist to, like I said before, negotiate how they want to be seen in these spaces. But I think something really important is really making sure there's literacy and communication and accessibility with these groups that have been marginalized, especially in institutions like this. So making sure there's clear compensation, there's clear authorship, there's clear, I keep saying agency, but making sure that the language that you're speaking is something that's accessible to these groups, and that it's not just a transaction or not just the latest fad to be supporting Indigenous people. It's something that really has to be built on equity, and something really fundamental to that equity is, you know, understanding, like I said before, that there's knowledges that we have that maybe don't relate to the knowledge you have, and we need to find ways to make sure that our knowledge is just as valid, and that we have a way to place ourselves in the mainstream world where we're not being taken advantage of.
I would like to comment on the idea of sustainability beyond the current moment, kind of adding to the ideas and comments that our friend Durante here is sharing, that regarding knowledge systems and how it gets recorded and shared, whether it's in the academy, or whether it's out in the street, or whether it's out in our gardens, I think it's about how we can, for example, one of the ways that we can do this is by expanding the ways that we cite our sources. And I'm really emboldened and kind of happy that there's new ways to cite the oral traditions within academic literature, that there's new templates that are being published, so that what is considered an ephemeral act of storytelling can find further life within academy, within archives, but also within our hearts as well, because so much of the knowledge systems that my community and other Indigenous communities are passing on is through the oral tradition. And so I think that's why so many of our elders are talking about the living knowledge that we're passing on, but how can this life infuse places like the academy? And so I'm really looking forward to the different ways that we can cite oral traditions, Indigenous knowledges, and so I think that's one of the ways that we can do that too.
Anyone else wants to add anything? So I think the next question I have is mainly from our side, right? For non-natives, how do we? I guess the question I want to get to is, how do we like build bridges, right, between someone coming from a place that is not familiar, not understanding how to, and I think you touched upon this, Dante, I think giving the agency, I think that helps a lot, communicating, right, instead of, so oftentimes museums or people that are trying to label, right, when we're working with collections, and we have to understand who's in our collection, how do we label this artist, how do they identify themselves as, and this comes into a big play where you do have to reach out, you do have to connect with the artist and understand how they want to be viewed. But do you see a lot of people in the community like open or excited about these projects, you know, like the project that we did here with Felipe and Khadijah? Is this something that the community would like to see more, like the art and other communities member engaging with projects outside and you know, being a part of other institutions that are not necessarily part of the community?
I'll just start and say, yeah, I think that that's something that specifically artists in the Seminole community really, really want, is to have their work be accessible to more mainstream audiences. I think a lot of people, like Seminole artists who make art about Seminole topics or Indigenous topics, are doing so as a way of like self-identifying and regaining that identity and how they relate to the world, and really kind of asserting that. That's a really big part of it. And I think something that's really important is a lot of times institutions or organizations come into our community and they see a need that they're perceiving and a need that they're assuming. Yeah. And a lot of times I think people just need to know that it's okay for a community to explicitly state a need before you go in and think that you're like, oh, I'm going to save the Seminoles by like doing this. Like a lot of times that initial agency is making sure that those people are at capacity and that they want to, you know, interact at that moment. And I think a lot of it is, like I said, that accessibility and language and how you're approaching people, and being conscious that, like, there's so many artists in our community. Almost everybody is an artist in our community, and everybody has really beautiful art that they'd like to share, but everybody also has, you know, we're surviving and we're trying to save our homelands. There's so many things that are needs that our communities have as frontline people of the Everglades, and that it can't always be prioritized to be in an institution. I think just understanding that and knowing that communication with our people isn't just about an inquiry of finding out more about what is Seminole culture, how can I support Seminole culture. It's also being understanding and knowing that communication has to be two-way, and not being defensive when we're like, okay, so where's this video going? Who's doing that? I need all the facts up front. I think, just being really transparent is something that's really valuable to us. I think something that happens a lot in our communities is people will be like, oh, let's collaborate, or let's do this, or let's be a partnership, when it just seems that they want an Indigenous person to come in on the last 2% of their project, so it seems like they did something with Indigenous people. And we all know what's happening, even if we don't have, like, the academic language to call it out. Like, we all know that's happening. Like, don't just be transparent if you want us to join in at the last 20 seconds or something. Like, I think just wait for our communication and really take value in what we're saying, is my advice.
Yeah.
In this, reflecting on the idea of building bridges, I think it's really useful to understand that we definitely got to be patient with each other. I mean, I know that we have one planet to share, but this planet is populated with cultures and communities. So we have many worlds, but one planet. And I think that from coming from the Miccosukee world, like, it takes a little bit of patience and time to work with people from my community, because we have a whole other set of priorities that we're upholding. And coming here into this world over here, the world of Miami, American society, Western culture, I mean, time is money. And y'all follow this beautiful device that ticks and talks and ticks and talks and continues. But for us out there in the Everglades, we look up to the moon, we pay attention to a lunar calendar, we have a ceremonial obligations to family, and sometimes that means that you just gotta wait, because we have things to do, and sometimes those things that we gotta do, unfortunately, you cannot participate in. But there's definitely things you can participate in, and I really appreciate how Dante and Khadijah and others really look to the natural world for their inspiration, because this natural world that does so much for us, what are we doing to give back to it? And I think that this is such a beautiful window onto some of these ways that we can express reciprocity and giving back to it. So I think it's a matter of respect and learning, like, what does respect mean to you and what does respect mean to me, because it's a whole different way of looking at things. I mean, when I was growing up, listening to elders speak and watching the elders speak to one another, you would think, like, they're not even paying attention to one another. Like, when elders are speaking, they might be looking at the ground or looking over here, but it's the things that they're saying that they really pay attention to, and that's what they hold on to. Whereas in other worlds, eye contact, face-to-face, one-on-one, whereas here we have community values. So I think it's just a understanding that we have worldviews to uphold. Sometimes that can overlap, and a lot of times it has definitely things that are very distinct for us too. So just as you have to learn to understand and respect where we're coming from, I think we have a lot of experience learning and understanding where others are coming from as well.
And I think, with this and your answers, I want to loop a little bit into the project that we have here, because, it was an experience that we had. And I first reached out to Houston after identifying that, we wanted to work with Felipe, and he has a background of collaborating with different communities, depending on where he is. And having his project here in Miami, we really wanted to connect with something site-specific. And that's how this collaboration started, and we reached out to Houston, who was super, super helpful and friendly, and helped us and held our hands a lot, us not knowing all of these questions that I'm asking here, right? Is this something that you're interested in working with us? How do we how do we do this project that's beneficial for both? And having these questions, right? Like being respectful of the community. So I want to go to Felipe a little bit and talk about this experience and working not only on this project, but with other projects. And you have a lot of that, working with different communities, from embroiders from Brazil and to Miccosukee here in Miami. So how do you approach this and start this relationship within your projects?
Well, thank you everybody for being here again one more time, and thank you for this beautiful panel. Yes, as Jennifer mentioned, I have collaborated with different communities in different places of Latin America, here in the States, some projects in Europe too. And what I've learned basically is that to always be very, as was mentioned here before by both Dante and Houston, to be very transparent, respectful, and basically setting the conditions where the dialogue and the collaboration is a two-way process, learning experience. I think and I hope that I learn as much as they learn, or with both sides are invested and both sides sort of gain. And when I mean gain, I mean like to learn, to like grow, because basically what we're doing together is creating something new, like and the project, basically the curtains and the whole process of making them is basically this bridge. It's a bridge between different cultures, different worlds, like Houston mentioned, and for example, each curtain in the exhibition, both outdoors and indoors, they have a design, a drawing, which we have an image here now, which is this very like formal and simple exercise that I do of drawing, of tracing, which is also very ancestral. It can look very contemporary or even futuristic or from space, but at the same time, it has a very, very, it can be ancestral language, it could be some kind of weird scripture, or it could be like from the planet Earth, or from, I also think of like some alien civilization. So it's something that's a bit very timeless or universal too. And that's basically abstraction, that's geometric abstraction, and which is also that a lot of cultures share. And for what has been mentioned here, a lot is that, of course, there's a whole Western history of abstraction imposed by, the history of European abstraction, and then what happened in the Americas and in the United States, so on and so on. And as a Chilean, when I went to art school, they will teach us, I had to learn everything from Europe, everything from Russia, and nobody told us about what the Mapuches were doing in the south of Chile. What was their understanding of abstraction, or how they apply it to their ceramics or their textiles? It wasn't something that was taught. It wasn't information that the institution, that academic, university, whatever, will be even interested in. So this is something that also, I come from this background that's, of course, it's super colonial in its setting. But then as I traveled and I was able to make projects, and even, it's a funny situation, but even living in New York, I was able to explore and understand more the Americas, making projects in Brazil, as you mentioned, Jennifer, or in Mexico. In Mexico, I also collaborated with a couple of artisans from the Huichol community, which is a nation in Mexico, in the Zacatecas area, state. And basically, for me, it's very important to be transparent, that the project is basically a bridge for making something new that is not, in that it's created upon a dialogue and a conversation that, for example, with Khadijah, and this is also something, it's funny to go back to this idea of time and how people understand time. I think we were, I don't know if lucky, but we were definitely touched by the pandemic, and that gave us more time. And I think that time was important to, at least for me, to, I think, really understand better the project, understand better what we were doing, understand how the history and the whole cultural weight of patchwork could be applied in a contemporary way, could be thought together with Khadijah. For example, we discussed and collaborated in the color decisions, color combinations, which is something super formal, super basic. But I opened this for discussion. I don't tell Khadijah. I didn't tell Khadijah, oh, use this color. It was a conversation. I proposed a background, and then Khadijah proposed a patchwork for that background with a color combination. And so it was a conversation that took maybe a year or more from the beginning until it was realized. And I think that's a beautiful, at least for me, that's the beautifulness of the project, that we created something together, and something that I wouldn't have made by myself, or maybe Khadijah wouldn't have made by herself. It was something that we did together. And expanding that, it's the institution of PAMM in collaboration with the Miccosukee community.
Yeah, and you touched on the collaboration, right? Like working with Khadijah, and was a constant back and forth between you choosing the designs, and then Khadijah also proposing a couple of patchwork designs, and even all the way to the end with the color combinations and combining them in the final process. So Khadijah, I want to hear a little bit about you, and we're so happy that you accepted and decided to work with us. The question, I almost want to go back a little bit to the beginning of what Dante mentioned, that a lot of like the art, mainstream conversation about art has a specific idea of what art is, or how artists make what are visual cultures, and how that's different. So Khadijah, I think maybe if you can speak about how art making in Miccosukee, in the Miccosukee community, or in Miccosukee and Seminole, how is that different? Like, how do you approach your designs? How do you approach the color and combining these traditional elements into the art making of what we see here? We saw a dress, we saw the bag, and using the materials. I think there's a lot of not only the formal qualities to it, the colors, the shapes, which I think you have a lot of fun with the colors and having bold colors, but also I think other layers to that, to what you're creating, included with the community and tradition. And also, like, what do you feel, like the end result of this project, right? Because it was, I think, something new to you, applying the patchwork in a whole different context. So how did you navigate towards this collaboration?
I mainly agreed to it as something that I wanted to make my grandpa proud, because he's the reason why I have that cultural center, and for my grandma as well, because I looked after her when she was making patchwork. So them two were the big benefactor why I agreed to this project. And yeah, most of the things that I've made, it's more of showing colors, and a lot of color combinations you would think that wouldn't work, but I basically just have a knack to make them work in a way. So with doing this, I like making patchwork, so it was easy for me. And I know Felipe, he wanted more of the girls that come to the center to help out, but it was a lot of me telling him that's not gonna work, because patchwork takes patience, skills, and not many girls have that. They're all like, I just want this done. Like, let me get out of here, kind of a reaction to it. So I was telling Felipe, like, I'm sorry, it's just gonna be me. There's only one of me, I could try as fast as I can, but there's life, Like Houston said, we have a lot of things, and putting a time on it is very nerve-wracking for me. So with this pandemic, I really appreciated the time that I was given with it as well. So yeah, that's what.
Yes, and I think the timing definitely helped us, but also, you touch on something very, I think important, right? We did come into the project thinking like working with a group of people, which is what Felipe is used to. But I think this, the end result is it's just so captivating because it is capturing your voice as an artist. It has we're giving. It's not a group project where you can't really name it. So I think that's, it actually turned out great, and we're so excited about that because we do see, we're putting your style out there. And then when we talk about, geometric abstraction, I think this is something so interesting to think about, having everything we are... every time we hear about geometric abstraction, like Felipe said, you think about European artists, Latin American, Russian, and we have this here. We have in various Native American cultures or indigenous cultures in other countries, and that is not, acknowledged as part of this context that it's used in the mainstream art world. So what do you guys have to say about that? Because to me, I think it's interesting to expose this and let our audiences know to consider, right, outside of what is given to us in textbooks to learn, like Felipe learned in school. I also learned in our history. So how do you guys feel, that a project like this and many other artists are doing? And I think exposing and, allowing other audiences to engage with this and consider. Do you think it helps in this dialogue of indigenous contemporary art within other institutions, the art fair, and whatnot?
Can I say something? Yeah. Well, what Jennifer is touching on is also something that I probably didn't have planned it, or I realized it while we were making the project. Basically, that it's also the way I work. I take these projects as I mentioned before, like a learning experience for both sides. For me, I learn a lot from the work when it's produced, when it's installed, from the people I work with. And in this case, learning about patchwork and the history of patchwork, like you see here in this image now, basically they are the most traditional ones are abstractions of the environment, of nature, you can see the rain, storm. Here, for example, there's a man on a horse on Dante's dress. And a few more worm on the top. That's the worm, right? Yes. And so there's a whole, each patchwork is an abstraction itself of nature, of the elements. And what I found, what I realized was really powerful in this project is that at the end, each curtain and the whole project is a dialogue between these two histories. One history is maybe the Western history of this sort of historical history of abstraction, and then we have this indigenous Native American use of abstraction, which, funnily enough, they both were born more or less at the same time, and for some reason we know a lot about one and not about the other. And so for me, it was a really, really amazing sort of result that, as I said, I didn't plan. That at the end, there's a dialogue between these two histories and a conversation, and sort of not only a conversation, but both of them are creating something different, so maybe a third, or as Houston also mentioned before, like a portal to a different world, and that's something that I really enjoyed about this project.
Before I share my comments, we're here at the Perez Art Museum, Miami, in an auditorium full of a great crowd. So I just want to take a quick poll. raise your hands, and if those that are streaming, maybe you might want to put it in your comments, but how many of you have actually been to the Everglades? Great. We have, I'd say about 90+% of the room here has been to the Everglades. That's amazing. And so I'm really happy for that, and I hope that you feel welcome to come out there and see what's out there and make friends with the land. But I say that because when we talk about the instance of this particular collaboration between Khadijah and Felipe here, the way that they have integrated the patchwork into the artwork that Felipe excels at, using the abstraction that the patchwork represents. Like, I'm reminded of this one particular photograph that I was like struggling to find in the archives, but I wasn't able to find it for you in time. So if you've been out to the Everglades before, imagine that you see one of the beautiful thatched roof huts, the Chikis, that the Miccosukee and Seminole people live in. And the Chiki is set at the edge of the tree island. So there's a little island, the Chikis there, and then beyond that is the expanse of the river of grass. And that's the photograph that me and my mom found in one of these archives. So the Chikis there, the workspace is there, and then the artist, the woman, had her sewing machine set up right there at the edge of the island so that she could see across the vastness of the greater Everglades. And that was the inspiration for and the birth of this particular expression of abstraction here. And so that was the birth of this beautiful abstraction that we're talking about here, the geometric patchwork here. And it was born at a time that was in modern era, embracing beautiful techniques of layering fabric on top of each other. Because back when it was first starting out, the women and some men only had access to thread and needles. So they started out using layers. But then when they had access to machines like the sewing machine, they were able to experiment and have fun and get really complex with these designs. So as you see the journey throughout the decades, it's going to get more complex, more sophisticated, and the storytelling really takes off as well. But I think that this particular expression of abstraction really helps us to point back to the Everglades and point back to the land here. And so I think that the journey of this patchwork really is a journey of worldviews and collaboration. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how we can have dialogue between these different knowledge systems, because we need it. Like, the world needs that right now. We have a serious global environmental crisis. We have incredible political and social polarization. So whatever we can do to find dialogue, to make friends, and also to have a good time, to celebrate, like, what's in our gardens, what can we share with each other, how can we sing and how can we dance, and how can we create opportunities for festivities with one another. So I think that's the potential for this kind of collaboration, whether it's abstract, whether it's figurative, whether it's literal, like, what can we do to dance with one another? And so I think that's the potential for reconciliation that is inherent in these sorts of collaborations. And I was super honored that Jennifer and Felipe were eager to reach out and build relationships with the indigenous communities here. And I'm super happy that there's quite a few art institutions that are leading the way on this front of reconciliation and collaboration. Like PAMM is doing it. They're doing a great job. The ICA Miami is doing it. They're doing a great job. But really, come on out to the Everglades and see what it's about. There was a time when I was collaborating, and I'm still collaborating with this really amazing art organization called the Artist in Residence in Everglades. And there was one particular executive director who is an amazing artist in her own right by the name of Deborah Mitchell. And she was telling me a little bit about her process too. And she was talking about how when she goes out to places like the Big Cypress National Preserve, you just kind of like stand in the sawgrass, stand amidst the cypress trees, and maybe kind of close your eyes a little bit and kind of let things blur. And what is it that stays with you? What endures? Is it a color? Is it a shape? Is it a sensation? So I was really happy that Deborah Mitchell was sharing some of that process, because I think that's one of the beautiful techniques that we can use to connect with these places. Just go out there and immerse yourself in it and see what comes up for you.
I think just to talk on really just the focusing on the formal aspects of the abstraction. So by formal, I mean like the visual forms and colors and impact aesthetically. I think something that's really important for everyone when approaching Seminole art or Miccosukee art or independent art, you know, the art of our people down here in South Florida and across Florida, is really understanding that you have to completely abandon all art history narratives because they definitely do not apply in the way you think it does. For example, the hybridity of Seminole people to utilize sewing machines in really bright, ostentatious colors is not belated, or it's not, you know, copying Western society. It in itself is hybridity and innovation from our culture of continuation and our ability to usurp, you know, the colors and the textiles and the other representations of the West into our own knowledge systems to represent ourselves, not just within our communities, but relate ourselves to the outside communities. I think that something that's really important is, like I said, understanding and kind of abandoning the idea that there's an authentic way to be Indigenous, or that Indigenous people have like an authentic like look to them or thing like that. Because as Khadijah's work, you know, kind of explains through its colors, and as Houston was saying, patchwork becomes more and more elaborate, and you would never see a Seminole or a Miccosukee person, you know, turn their nose up at a new patchwork design or a new innovative thing by being like, oh, that's not authentic, that's not how that was done, Indians only live in the past, because we're people who are still inventing and still innovating, you know, those traditions. And something that's really important is, as Houston says, we really respect and keep hold of those values. So our values of, you know, representing nature and reciprocity and relating to one another, but that doesn't mean we can't continue and we can't grow in ways that speak to, you know, the wider mainstream art world. And I think something really important about that is looking at the birth of, you know, sweetgrass baskets like this and patchwork coming about in the turn of the century and also through the 20s and 30s at the same time that Art Deco and Abstraction and Cubism was coming about. You know, it was speaking to those wider communications of what art is in not just America, but the world. And it was really having its own foot in those conversations, even though institutions like museums or academia hasn't, you know, preserved us being part of those conversations. We really were. And it was something that was undeniable when you look back at our own archives and our own oral histories.
Anyone else? Khadijah, I have a question for you that, you know, just to piggyback on what Dante said about the creation, right? We have some designs here, right, on the screen that are, I would say, more traditional, more yeah, like more known, and everyone shares. And I remember you were even talking about when you were creating these, you had a book that you were looking at to, you know, source, look at these resources of designs that people share with one another. But in this context of like creating something new, which is what Dante mentioned, you know, that people are still creating, and you're not, you know, ostracized for that, for moving away from the traditional design. So how do you engage with that as an artist? I know you, when we were talking, you said that you like to work with bold colors, which you mentioned, but do you also create new designs? Do you move away, and how is that done? Are you looking at your surroundings, as many artists did in the past, to create what we just saw? You know, we have patchworks that designs that represent fire, rain, and whatnot. But to work with something new, what do you get inspired by, and what do you look at to get your new creations?
The inspiration usually just comes to me in the moment. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't sit there and ponder about it. I just, you know, it just pops in my head most of the time. So I really don't have like a really good answer to it.
I think I do have an example that maybe you can expand upon. The colors, right? Well, when we go to your studio and see, and even your Instagram, I think there's some examples there that how do you look at color? There were some fabric, I think there's SpongeBob and Spider-Man, all of these fabrics, I think, in your studio, and you look at is that could you expand on how you look at these fabrics and in a way extract the colors and add it to the patchwork or create patchworks with that?
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Well, for me, when I make something, I usually use floral fabrics. So I just look at that, and most of the colors are already there. You just got to pick which one pops out, or you can make it pop out more. It usually works out that way for me, because if you don't use the right colors, it just looks camouflaged. Mm-hmm. So that's most of the ways for it helps me in a way.
Yeah.
I think I'm getting it right.
No, that's a good guide, because, you know, a lot of, I think, designers do that too, right? With the drop tool on the computer, so you select the color to then make the design work cohesively and the colors combination. But then I want to ask more about like the you know, going back to that initial theme that we talked about, how the visual cultures are different, right? How is it different? How do we look at art differently? How does Miccosukee and Seminole create art? And what is the difference? And what are the similarities of the two, you know?
I'll just begin very broadly. I think like the concept of art, so an item or a visual culture existing solely for like something of status to be institutionalized or consumed isn't really like translatable into our culture. So like baskets and patchwork and other things like that, even if it's something like dolls that we kind of advanced our innovation of to sell to tourists, but even things like that aren't necessarily seen as like, oh, this one's strictly art and it's higher than this, and this one's craft because women do it or something like that. Like kind of the way our visual culture relates to everything is not really bound by institutionalized narratives of one being higher than the other or one being like anything like that. And I think something that I won't speak too much into, but that is really important is that just because we do have a lot of visual cultures that are secular, there are a lot of like, I guess, very ceremonial things about certain things like beadwork. Certain people can make bandolier bags. Certain people can make maybe this style of basket if that's what their clan taught them. So there are like more in-depth things that are shared amongst our community and in certain families. But for the most part, it's not like there's a huge hierarchy of who can create what and where beyond those, like, I guess, communal values. And I think something else that's really worth mentioning is we talk a lot about these knowledge systems, you know, behind these visual cultures. And your story with Khadijah and that conversation just reminded me, but a lot of times, like, patchwork and clothing has developed into a knowledge system in our own communities of how we identify and relate to one another. So the more ostentatious you dress, that means you're going to go see people or you're going to go trade or you're going to go do something. And I think it's fun how that's been, you know, progressing and innovated in our communities today because everybody gets their best dresses made for ceremony when they're going to see everybody from all the other reses. Or even just something that I think is like, I, as an art history nerd, absolutely freak out about this, but my favorite, like one of my favorite seamstresses, Melissa DeMeo, she sews her like Chanel and Hermes like ribbons into her skirt. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's like the same as like our ancestors putting like coins on and things like that. Like I just love that kind of innovation and that knowledge system, you know, being preserved and not being, you know, watered down or changed because of outside fashion or outside art. You know, we still stay true to like what clothing means to us and how we dress in front of one another. Or maybe, Houston, I've heard you talk about this, but how parents dress their babies, like that being like a show of love to not only your baby, but the community. Like, look, this is my baby all decked out. So yeah, I think there's lots of things to be mentioned, but I know Houston definitely can speak more and is wanting to speak about those knowledge systems and the invention of patchwork.
Yeah, you touched on some of the important values of the collective and the communal values and the broader society of clans that we uphold. And so I think that so much of what we create that some people might call art is about upholding that. Like, what can we do to serve our community? What can we do to serve our family? And I'm super happy that you touched on the importance of the ceremonial life of the community, because that is the foundation that has sustained us through time. So I think that those are some of the ways that we look at what some people refer to as art. And I'm really happy that that we can learn so much from like Western culture and other civilizations that have really took the time to articulate artistic disciplines. I mean, into the disciplines that we elaborate so much of today. So much of that is integrated in our society, into our communities, because whereas the people might talk about color theory, we might look at it from a healing perspective. Like this particular design that's emblazoned across my shirt is really depicting some of the weather patterns out there that you can see, which is the lightning design. But this particular color combination is super important. It's really foundational to our way of life out there in the Miccosukee and Seminole worlds. And this is a spiritual philosophy that we're upholding that we refer to as a circle of life. And so I think that when we have the privilege and the gift to learn from indigenous communities about what these spiritual philosophies mean, I think that that's a beautiful thing that we can tap into. I mean, you can only go a certain way into like the spiritual practices of Miccosukee and Seminole people before we can tell you, hold on, that's sacred. But I think that there's a lot of things that we can share in that too. And so I think that so much of it is a foundation of joy, is a foundation of healing, and it's a foundation also of like reciprocity. Like, what are we doing to give back to our community? Not only the people communities that we are here, but the community of species that we share with on the planet. And so I think that that's some of the ways that we might assess artistic value, status, and joy. Like, how much is of what you're creating and doing giving back to the circle of life? And so I think that those are some of the ways that we can assess artistic value from Miccosukee or Seminole perspectives.
Thank you. That was amazing. And maybe I think I'm just keeping time here because I don't want to go on too long, and I do want to leave room for questions. But you talked about something, you know, like maybe you can touch upon what we have here, because you mentioned, you know, the artistic ways in the environment, what's part of the culture, how do you look at the environment. And this was discussed during the whole panel, but I loved all the proposals that you mentioned. We're going to be, you know, I should mention, we're going to look at the video you told me to look at, the song that, you know, hopefully we get to share later, the decor that you mentioned here. You were asking me if it's part of an aesthetic, and when you asked if it was part of the aesthetic and if it was okay, I thought it's okay. You know, we're here to open a platform and welcome and learn from it too. So, do you want to mention why we put these alligator heads here? The colors too. You touched it briefly, but these colors are, you know, play an important role too. And yeah.
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, like on the first layer, like these are our friends, these are our buddies. Like we grew up with these beautiful animal species out there. The alligators are so iconic when you think about the Everglades. They thrive out there, but recently, I guess it was a result of a hurricane that passed by like almost 10 years ago in the region that had an environmental impact where the food source of these alligators, you couldn't find them no more. And so since that time, we were looking at like skinnier and skinnier and skinnier alligators. Like they weren't doing so good. So we were collaborating as Miccosukee and Seminole people with the scientists from FIU and other institutions to kind of really look at like what's going on with these alligators, like why are they sick? But it's taken some time for their health to come back. And so I think that points to like how we need to treat nature. Like so much of our contemporary way of life, and I am complicit in it too, because I use my gadgets, and my gadgets require electricity and power, and that is a demand that we put on the environment. millions of gallons of water are flowing through nuclear power plants, through wastewater treatment plants, through the energy and mineral extractions that fracking and oil drilling requires. And so I think that it's an example of like, what can we do to give back and support nature in her rhythms? And sometimes that means you have to leave it alone, because the water needs to rise and fall for the food stuff of the birds to come back, for the food stuff of the alligators to come back. And so I'm really happy to report that these alligators are getting healthier and coming back. So first of all, they're our friends. But second of all, I think like on a poetic or metaphorical level, I think it points to like our fears as well. Because like, what are we afraid of? And when I take people out there to the glades, like people are like, am I gonna die out there? Like, are there snakes? And are we gonna see pythons and alligators fighting? You might. I mean, I have once or twice. But I think like what I'm saying is, don't let these things get in the way of establishing your relationship with nature. So I think it's about going beyond your fears to build relationships with different species, to build relationships with different communities, and to see what we can do to honor the values of other systems. And I think that comes to the heart of what decoloniality is about, honoring the values of other systems. And so that's what those colors are referring to, the value and the values of the circle of life. It's a healing system. It's a system that brings us balance, that points to the potential for peace and reconciliation. And I think like when you put these colors together, it puts a smile on a person's face, so it brings joy. And so I think that these are metaphors for the kind of conversation that we're having here today. What can we do to bring our knowledges together? And so as a gift to the broader society, one of the things that me and my friends in the Love the Everglades movement have done is collaborated with activists from cities all across the nation to create climate change resiliency tools. And in those tools that we offer on our website, it talks about centering the marginalized voices, diverting the benefits that we can get as we transition to clean energy to Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities of color. And so I think that in helping to support the rhythms of nature, giving nature a chance to heal, and giving communities a chance to heal from the traumas of the historical traumas that we're all still dealing with, I think that that's what these beautiful objects, our beautiful friends, these beautiful colors are pointing to. Like, what can we do to collaborate? What can we do to create art? And I think that that's why I'm so proud of what Felipe and Khadijah have done, because even in creating beauty, they create a pathway forward. And I was super inspired and reminded when Felipe was talking about how these curtains in the installation, these fabric panels could be perceived as walls sometime. But as Angela Davis reminds us, walls turned sideways are bridges. And so I think that this is what these represent.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Houston. I think this is a great ending, and yeah, like you mentioned, in putting this exhibition together and in deciding like how do we do this, a lot of there are fears. You know, how do we do this properly? How do we do this respectfully? How do we create a bridge if the other side wants a bridge? So I think, like I said, this is hopefully one of many more to come. We're all learning how to dialogue with one another, how to respect one another. So thank you, everyone. Let's, I think, open up for questions so we have time to ask any questions from the audience or... Yes, right here.
Okay. If anyone has questions, we're going to pass this mic around. If anyone has questions, we're going to pass the mic around. That way everyone can hear it. It's part of the recording. Folks on YouTube can also hear it. If you're on YouTube, please post your questions in the chat now.
And please, we want to make friends. What is your name?
Hi, my name is Ian. I have a question. If I, as I am today, am moved, I want to pay a visit to the Everglades, but, you know, some of our friends are creepy crawlies and alligators, and you know, my heart is bigger than my courage in this situation. How can I first interact with the Everglades wisely and responsibly, carefully, but still put those roots down after having lived in South Florida for so long? That's my question. Thank you.
Suggestions? All right, cool. I would like to offer some suggestions. I have a nonprofit that's called Love the Everglades Movement, and one of the things that we do, that we specialize in, are field trips. So there's a number of daytime activities that you can do out there that are really safe, they're really fun, and that are comfortable. Like, you don't necessarily have to get your feet wet, but you can. But start out easy. Go out to the national parks, go out to your state parks, go out to your local parks, get connected with the green spaces. In fact, bring these green spaces back to your homes too. Native plant gardens. You can have the Everglades in your backyard if you plant these things there. But you can go out to places like the Big Cypress National Preserve has the Oasis Visitor Center. There's boardwalks there. And when you feel comfortable, there's beautiful trails out there that you can explore as well. And take your time. Take your time. One step at a time. And there's a lot of things that like I said, you can do in the daytime, but there's wonders that await at night as well. Because at night, you're going to see that the river of grass becomes the river of stars. So actually, on December 13 is our next meteor shower. That's the Geminids meteor shower. A great opportunity to come out to the Everglades and remind yourself of your place in the universe. And if you want somebody to come out with you, hit us up at the Love the Everglades movement. We'd be happy to go out there and have a good time with you.
I want to go.
Come on out.
Hello, I'm Dudley. I have a question. I know patchworks are used to tell stories. I want to know what kind of themes are explored in those stories, and how do they change over time, and how do they reflect today's world?
I think some of the themes that we're looking at is kind of the things that we've been talking about this afternoon. We've been talking a little bit about the historical journey. So there's history encoded in some of the patchwork designs, like the man on the horse. There's environmental themes, like the trees and the plants and the weather. I think there's also like spiritual themes too, because we can look at the way that the lines intersect, and that kind of reminds us of our cooking chickies. Like whenever we cook our food, there's this beautiful fire, and there's usually like 4 logs at the center of the chickies. And it's not just the kitchen, but it's also a place that we have like beautiful ceremonies over there too. So I think you got history, you got the environment, you got the spirit, but also like you have jokes. We got jokes, people. So like when Khadijah and others were talking about like the patchwork that's looking at minions, pop culture, haute couture, brands showing up in these patchwork designs. I think those are some of the cultural wealth that is displayed in there too. And I think that's where the value and the values of other systems come in. And as a filmmaker and a cinematographer, I'm really happy that there's documentaries that critique so much of Western civilization and the traumas that we've endured. And I'm particularly thinking about this beautiful series called Exterminate the Brutes. And if you have a chance to look at that, you're going to see the impact that colonization has. And I'm super honored that that particular filmmaker opened up this series with a look back at the Seminole War era and the impact that that has and continues to have on our societies. And so I think that these are some of the major themes that we look at: history, environment, spirit, and a good time. Have a laugh. Why so serious?
Hi, my name is Preston. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about your two-spirit identity and how it informs your artistic praxis.
Yeah.
I'll go first. I think we can both answer this. But yeah, I think two-spirit identity is something that's really fundamental in understanding how you relate to your society. I think in terms of how it informs my practice, two-spirit kind of informs everything that I do because it's spiritually how I relate to other people and how I see myself relating to other people. So just sort of being open without judgment and letting things unfold the way they naturally want to unfold. I think also something that's really important about two-spirit is like the ability to accept questioning, so to accept that things aren't definite or things aren't always permanent and things can be in flux and relate to one another in maybe one world or the other, be it feminine, masculine, spiritual, animal, human, whatever that is. Just understanding that there's a bridge between all these things really informs kind of just different perspectives on how you approach things and the permanence of what you're doing. And I think it also, in relating to activism and our role on this earth, it really brings a lot of urgency and value into the things we're doing and the way we're presenting ourselves. At least that's what I find. I think in broader terms, like, or more specifically culturally, there's some things that are gendered in our communities, like some crafts that are gendered or maybe some arts that are gendered. And I think that's about, giving time and space and patience to understanding how your identity as a two-spirit fits within these systems in a really respectful way that's mindful of how you'll ultimately relate to your clan or your family or the wider community. But yeah, I think overall it's sort of seeing yourself or really enacting as a bridge between worlds, and also knowing that there's so much to be done as a two-spirit person and really feeling that urgency and that call to, fight colonization in any way you can.
Yes, all right. And so the way I interpret and express the two-spirit movement, the two-spirit ideas in my life, I understand that the two-spirit movement has very specific cultural origins in communities, for example, like the Anishinaabe people and other communities that have traditions of gender diversity, meaning that there are communities that have expansive notions of gender and gender fluidity. And so I think that's where it begins for me. But like the way it shows up in my life is that definitely honoring gender diversity, letting people live their truth, respecting people, that's pretty basic and fundamental. And I find that a lot of two-spirit people are the knowledge keepers, because as a decolonial movement, it's about staying connected to our roots. And like that's what it has helped me in my life, because when I first came out as a gay man, I felt that being a part of the LGBTQ community meant that I had to leave my community. But I find that the two-spirit movement helps me stay rooted in my community. So it's about staying connected to the roots. And what that means for me is I got to support my tribe. I got to do what I can to help my people out, my family out, my community out. And I think that just points back to the collective and communal values that we've been talking about here. And definitely joy, definitely collaboration. So like that's how two-spirit movement has informed my praxis.
Hello, my name is Annette, and I commend PAMM for doing this exhibit and panel and collaboration. I'm wondering what kind of, and I know that PAMM has a very strong commitment to collect art from people of color. A new acquisition was just announced yesterday or today. I wonder what commitment is there to collect, to actually permanently collect from Native American artists in different media, whether locally, because in the Seminole and Miccosukee there are a number of skilled painters and sculptors working in the Western canon of fine art, and regionally and nationally, there are quite a number of amazingly skilled artists.
Thank you. That's a very good question, because I think, as institutions, I think the last year, a lot of institutions have been, looking at their strategic planning, looking at, to see how to implement DEI, and this is, diversity, equality, a lot of, how to do that, how to have diversity within museums, and how to strategically tackle it, not only through exhibitions, staffing. Specifically, as you mentioned, we do have the Black Art Fund, we have the Latin American Latinx Art Fund too, which it doesn't acquire but does direct funds to exhibitions and programming. We have the CCI, which is the Caribbean Cultural Institute. So we're slowly getting there. We don't have anything specific about Indigenous art and artists. We have in the past presented every time we have Collectors Council, which is a group that meets twice a year. It's an opportunity for us as curators to look at, what's missing, where are the gaps in our collection? Because certain times we do have control through these acquisitions, and certain times we, donations come in that we're happy to accept of other artists, and that creates indifferences within the balance, right, of what we have in the collection. So these moments, like the Collectors Council and other funds that we have, that's the opportunity that we have to look at the gaps within the collection. The programming was, when we work with this, we have been talking a lot about how can we collaborate with Miccosukee, and when Felipe came in, that was, just the light bulb, like, okay, this is great, let's start this first step with collaborating with our neighbors. But then going back to Collectors Council, that is a moment where we try to, but as I mentioned, we don't have specific numbers. Sometimes I think it's important, you can't assess improvement unless you have numbers, but it gets a little bit complicated too. Not always when we're seeking out an artist, they have work available. So if we have to meet that number, how do we deal with that? So as curators, that's a big important part of our conversation, and looking at the gaps of our collection, what is missing. And in the past, we have actually proposed a couple of artworks to purchase. Some get selected, some don't. So we're juggling, and we're trying to find it. But I think this, this talk today and the exhibition is a first big step for us to keep in mind. And as I mentioned in the beginning, how can we keep this sustainable? We don't want to just do this exhibition one time and then that's it. Say we work with the Miccosukee. So me as a curator, I'm thinking as I was preparing for this panel and I was reading other talks, the Walker did a really interesting conversation with a couple of Native American artists and curators. So after reading that, it made me think a lot about how, we can implement certain parts of that discussion in this museum. But I would say we still have a long way to go, but we're all, putting our efforts there. Yes. Any other questions?
Hello, my name is Danny. I just really wanted to have a moment to speak because my mind is spinning with so many new perspectives that I never really expected to be hearing and thinking today. For context, I'm Colombian native, and I studied art history at the University of Florida, and I was the first person at the University of Florida to study pre-Columbian art history as a discipline, and that experience in and of itself was met with so much resistance, so much loose ends of knowledge, so much stories of disruption, so much stories of knowledge loss, that it was almost upsetting to me to understand Indigenous contemporary art and see the resilience and the vitality of it still today and where I'm from. And this just seems like such a big thing for me to be at a talk at PAMM about Indigenous contemporary art, because we come from so much loss, and people want to focus on that loss. But when you actually hear Indigenous people speak, all you hear is like everything that we make is still so full of life, of resilience, and so full of these same life patterns and same life cycles. Like you were talking about, the circle of life is like so like ingrained in what we make with our own hands. So it's not even just like the practice, it's more so about the practice of like that meditative process of being one with art, you know? And listening to you guys share so much about patchwork reminds me of like molas in native Colombia. Like the Guna people make molas, and it was really funny to me to like be visiting Colombia and see these molas sold on the street, and it's like minions, or like or like these like traditional hand sewn patchwork designs, but they're like of Santa Claus or Jesus Christ, you know, like, and a lot of people, like we were talking about today, like it's like a loss of tradition, but I see that as like so much resilience, like so much like a new way of life of these new people who are like carving out a space for themselves because they've had to for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I just feel absolutely touched to hear you guys speak, and it's been absolute pleasure to like hear you talk.
Thank you, Danny, right?
Yes, Danny.
Thank you. And I liked how the phrase that you were using, carving out space for ourselves, because I think that that's so much of what we're doing. We may not be carving out space, but reclaiming the space. Just the other week, I was in a meeting with the EPA and the Miccosukee tribe, and we're still reclaiming that space. Indian country, Indian land, it is still up for debate. And so, like this idea of world building, there's this gentleman whose media critique or media analysis that I've been really appreciating. Go check out this website. It's called HP Critical, and there you're going to find an author that is published under the name of Duende. But they've really looked at like the world building that is done in the video game world, gamers, and how is indigeneity represented in video games. How are the other ways that we're reclaiming space? Because what we're doing out there when it comes to the Everglades is not necessarily world building, but rebuilding. How can we get water flowing like it used to? What can we do to get the birds back? What can we do to get the mammals and the other species back? So like sometimes we're world building, sometimes we're world rebuilding, and I think that the technological definitely has a place for that. And I think that even in what some people can think of as frivolous playthings as video games, has a very serious impact in how we view ourselves, what is our sense of self-esteem, where is our pride. And I think that so much of the pride is on display here in this ostentatious beauty of Khadijah's skirt, of Dante's garments, of the patchwork that I'm wearing. And so I'm really happy that the PAMM is embracing our fabulousness today.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up. So I just want to thank everyone for coming, and thanks to the participants as well. Thank you so much.